Well, John, thank you very much for joining us.
No, everyone thanks me. I'm very grateful for giving me a chance to talk about my book. Thank you.
One of the things, first of all, that struck me about your book is that you always emphasise throughout it the sheer effort and work that goes into writing really, really funny comedy. And you also emphasise the fact that being funny is the most important thing, being really, really, really funny.
Yeah, I realised I remember coming back from America and watching some shows at that time. I won't say it was in them because they were very clever, but I thought these are clever and not funny.
Yeah.
And I thought about it, and I think that it's much, much harder to be really funny than it is to be clever. So that was a starting point. But, you know, there's all this stuff all the time in the papers about John Cleese, the comedy genius, or the ex-comedy genius. I was never a genius because I had to work so hard to do it. You know, I think it was Bernard Shaw who said genius was 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And in my case, it's about 98%, because when I did Fish Called Wanda, which I do think is a very good script, and I actually got an Oscar nomination for it, but it took me 13 drafts. Now, that's a lot of time. And I know Richard Curtis, when he started writing the Notting Hill films, he always remembered how many drafts I'd done on that. And the only person I've ever met who was a genius was Peter Cook, because if you wanted 5 minutes of funny material, you just switched the tape recorder on and Mr. Cook spoke for 5 minutes. I mean, it was all usable.
And you always say, you make the point that because he was so naturally funny and brilliant, that he didn't actually have a discipline to fall back on.
Well, when it stopped flowing effortlessly, he didn't know how to sit down and grind it out as the rest of us do. But, you know, if you just get used to the rhythms of writing, you discover there are some days when you don't write much and other days when you do write quite a lot. And Chapman and I, some days we just had a very much an off day, and then we'd have a great day. But we knew we could average 3 to 3.5 minutes a day. So you see what I mean? In a week, 5 days, 5 working days, we're talking 15 to 20 minutes. Well, when you've got 3 other Pythons writing, you know, Mike and Terry together and Eric, then you're well over the half-hour mark. Each week you're producing more than one show. And that's why I think Python was so original. We had slight mixture of styles, but there was so much stuff in there.
There's a hilarious bit where you list out your mother's phobias.
Oh, yes.
I realised when I was reading it, you used for Sybil Fawlty and Fawlty Towers, that she has that bit where she says, like, my mother is a bit of a trial, actually. And then she starts doing all the sort of confined spaces, open spaces and things like that.
That's right. Well, there were most of the things worried her one way or another or made her anxious. And the bigger, you know, I grew up the first few years on a farm. And, of course, that was a terrible place for her because it wasn't just cows and sheep and pigs and dogs, but there were chickens and ducks and all these huge, threatening sort of pseudo-velociraptors. And, of course, she was scared of every single one of them. I don't think... Actually, she wasn't really scared of cats, but anything else with 4 legs that could move, she was terrified. And creepy crawlies, spiders, horrified by snakes, was just an endless list of things that terrified her. She was very intelligent, but very, very neurotic, basically. And people who are terribly anxious tend to be depressed a lot of the time. And she was depressed a lot of the time. I mean, but I was able to use her black sense of humor because after Dad died, I used to call her regularly, a couple of times a week. And the theme was basically always that she was depressed. And, you know, when your mum says she's depressed, you want to do something about it, but you can't suddenly take someone who's 80 years of age, be depressed all her life, and change it. So you think, well, what can I do? And on one occasion, when she was quite literally telling me all the reasons why she didn't want to go on living, I just said to her, well, I'll tell you what, if you're feeling this way next week, I know a little man in Fulham, and I can give him a call if you like, but only if you like, and he can come down to Weston and kill you. And there was this total silence, and then she shrieked with laughter. And any time after that she started saying how depressed she was, I'd listen for a little bit, and then I'd say, well, should I call the little man in Fulham? And she'd laugh. So I found a way of getting her out of her depression by making her laugh, all based on her black sense of humour. But she was a very anxious woman.
It's interesting, your interest in psychology and in your family's psychology is a huge theme in your book.
You see, I think that's the thing that always interested me from the age of 14 or 15, because I can remember black and white BBC documentaries when I was 14, 15, and about subjects. I remember there was one which they blew little... They gave a cat 2 saucers. One had alcohol and the other had milk, and of course he was not the slightest bit interested in the alcohol.
Yeah.
And then they frustrated the cat, which actually in retrospect wasn't very nice, but it wasn't so bad. They blew little puffs of air in his face, which he didn't like, so screwed his face up. After a time, he started drinking the alcohol.
Yeah.
Now, that stuck in my mind forever. And that I must have watched that about 1955.
Yeah.
60 years ago, and I can still remember that and other shows. So all the way, as I wrote the book, I realized that all the way through my life I was kind of edging towards that subject, but I didn't actually get there till I co-wrote the books with Robin Skinner, which was 40 years later.
Do you think your interest in psychology, do you think you worked that out through your comedy in a way? Is that a different way of approaching the
No,
same
there's a
thing?
lot of stuff that you read in newspapers about people working things out. I'm a bit dubious myself. I remember saying to somebody once, well, if this artist has worked his stuff out, why does he keep writing the same play again and again and again? And that's what happens, you know. So I think it can happen, but I think it can happen if you've got a very good therapist guiding you. I think if you keep... people's problems tend to stay, I think, rather similar over the years, and I think that's why so many people do write the same book or the same play over and over again.
Yeah. It's also one of the few books I've read which mentions Peter Sellers, which doesn't have a sort of an unpleasant story. But Peter Sellers is he's such a complex character.
He was very complex, and he was tortured. I mean, he was. There were an awful lot of things there. I can tell you stories about him. I mean, I went to see him once early in the morning with Graham Chapman, and we'd written some pages, for a film we were writing for him. And we were told by his chauffeur, Bert, who was lovely, he said, "Sorry, boys, he's overslept. Here's a cup of coffee. He'll be out in a few minutes." And when he came out in his dressing gown, he was apologising for being late. He was talking to us in a voice we'd never heard before. And we thought... I checked this with Graham afterwards, and he said this is exactly what happened. Then, as he came around the table, he suddenly started talking in a rather sort of posh, rather funny voice. And then a moment later, he started talking like that. And then he sat down and started talking in some strange accent, sort of Eastern European. And then suddenly, he was speaking in his own voice. And when Graham and I compared notes afterwards, we realised that first thing in the morning, he had to find his own voice. Now, he can have had very little sense of who he was like.
You were mentioning Graham Chapman there. The book, and particularly in the latter half of the book, it feels like a very affectionate sort of letter to Graham Chapman in many ways, because he's another one who could be... well, allegedly very difficult or awkward, but
he was definitely very odd, Gray. I mean, he had a kind of passing relationship with reality a lot at the time, and these are stories I'll get into more on the next book. But he was very bright intellectually, but he was not very bright emotionally. And he was always late for everything. Well, that's all right now and again, but if it's every time over several years, you kind of think, well, why don't you do something about it? But the Pythons were always too scared to confront him or indeed each other. So that kind of behavior he got away with it. But he could get very, very aggressive in the early years when he got drunk. And then when Python started, I think he was almost at his best, because I don't think he and I ever wrote better material than we did for the first 2 series of Python. And the glorious thing about Gray, when I think of Gray now, I can just see him falling about with laughter, because we used to hoot when we got a funny idea and we suddenly saw the possibilities. We would go almost crazy. We'd drum our feet and we'd run around the room and sort of almost high fives. We didn't do high fives in those days, but it was that kind of celebratory, ridiculous behaviour, as though we'd scored a winning goal in the cup final or something. And then we'd sit down and spend the rest of the day writing it, but we would hoot with laughter. And it was a wonderful experience, because he was a wonderful match for me, and he laughed at the same things. We laughed at exactly the same things.
Were those the most enjoyable elements of those days?
For me, the writing's always been the best, and writing with Gray at that time was absolutely marvellous. And then after 2 years, we suddenly realised that very rapidly he'd become an alcoholic, and I can still remember that we were sitting in a trailer, and we were about to shoot the film version, not the TV version, the film version of Upper Class Twits. And we were looking for a script, and Michael Palin said, oh, he travelled in with Gray in the morning. He said, I know Gray's got a script in his little suitcase. And so we opened the suitcase, took the script out, and then Michael sort of looked very odd, and we said, what's the matter? And he pulled out a bottle of vodka, and he said, that was full when he put it in there this morning, and it was half empty, and it was 10:30 in the morning. And that's when we began to realise that things were not good. And then the third series is a bit of a nightmare because he couldn't remember in the afternoon what we had written in the morning, and he couldn't remember his lines, and he spoiled a lot of shows, which is a shame because he was a wonderful actor. He was the best actor of all of us.
So there's going to be a second volume.
Yes, there will be.
Said now.
But not for a time, because I think the mistake often is to start on something. I mean, this was the most pleasant experience I've had for years, because I think there's something wonderfully dignified about writing, because you get in there in the morning and you can puddle around and put up a shelf and put some books in alphabetical order and some mend your socks and all, sharpen pencils, make coffee, all that stuff. And then when you get down to it, you can work for as long or as little as you like. You just have to get it done. And when you're filming, for example, it's absolutely horrible, because some 17-year-old will say, we'll be picking you up in the morning, Mr. Cleese, at 5:45, and you want to say something very rude to him, and you have to say, yes, fine, I'll be ready at 5:45. So you have control over your time, and that's why I love it. And I also think it's so much more creative than acting. I know people are surprised by that, but I think acting is primarily interpretative, and writing is basically is creative. And the people that I really admire tend to be writers.
Well, on that note, I think we probably...
It was a bit heavy, wasn't it?
No, that was...
Shall I blow a raspberry?
Well, on that note, that's certainly a good place. Anyway, thank you very much for talking to us, John. So anyway, John Cleese's autobiography is out now, and you can buy a copy in the Reader's Digest shop.